Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 16th and final chapter in the Gospel of Mark. Here we read of the resurrection account. But before we read and review that verse by verse, we want to review what we covered in the preceding chapter. So everything which takes place in the preceding chapter, the events described therein are logically and chronologically in order for that reason. So we read of the trial, the sentence, the humiliation, the crucifixion, the death, and the burial of the one who was resurrected in the 16th chapter. And each of these things had to take place in order for the greatest miracle of all, the resurrection, which gives our life and faith and everything else meaning. It is the most controversial yet crucial claim of our faith, but it all had to happen out of something negative. So we're going to review what we read of the trial. The Jews had successfully indicted him according to the blasphemy, but in order to inflict capital punishment, because they were a subject people, they had to do so at the behest and permission of their Roman masters. So they turn him over, they deliver him to Pilate in the first verse, and he asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" They had indicted him for blasphemy, but the Romans could care less about religious violations of subject people. But the charge that they leveled before him was that he claimed to be king of the Jews. The Romans, this could be interpreted by them as by face value as treason and sedition, because no man could claim to be king without Rome's consent and approval. And he says, "You say that I am," and he asks them again, and he refuses to answer, verse 5, but Yahshua still gave no answer, so that Pilate marveled. So Pilate knew something was up. He knew there was something extraordinary about the man who he confronted. And so he's inclined to let him go. Verse 10, for he knew that the chief priest had handed him over because of enemy. So he sees right through this ploy. He sees through his subject people. These are the ones who had sentenced him to death, and they wanted his permission to do it, and they knew it because he was threatening their popularity and taking away their disciples, and the envy was palpable among them because he was more popular and more substantial than they were. Verse 15, and Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and having whipped, he delivered Yahshua over to be impaled. Barabbas was a literal agitator, a literal revolutionary, a zealot who had led an armed insurrection against his Roman masters. And as per the customs of the Passover, remember this occurred Passover weeks, one of the Roman customs was to release a captive prisoner to freedom from their Jewish people, and they chose Barabbas. They were baying for the Messiah's blood, but Pilate was a coward. He gave in to the sin of peer pressure. Follow not a multitude to do unto evil, we read of in Exodus 23:2. And because Pilate cowered out on his conviction, he was convinced that this man was innocent, that he did not merit it. He turned him over to be whipped and ultimately crucified. Although he does wash his hands in other accounts to say that his hands are clean. But, and when they had mocked him, they took the purple on him and put on his own garments on him and led him out to be impaled. So before they exposed him to the excruciating physical agony of having nails drawn in his hands across a wooden beam, unable, asphyxiating from the suffocation of that, before all that had to happen, there had to become the humiliation. He was beaten well in advance, and so potent was the beating that the Romans would administer against their soon-to-be crucified people that it was not uncommon for many men to die from the beatings that they had received beforehand. And Yahshua certainly endured an above average, above ordinary amount of physical punishment towards him, and the mockery really added insult to injury. So the injury was the profound pain, but they also, hailed him as the King of Jews. Purple was the color of royalty, and it was all just to humiliate him before he was impaled. But the secret to humiliation is that if you are humble, you can never be humiliated. And the Messiah was humility in personified form. Then leads to the crucifixion, and it was the third hour, and they impaled him. The third hour would have been 9 o'clock in the morning, so that's when they started impaling him. And then, just the excruciating agony. In Luke's account, there's 2 thieves that everyone's mocking him. They're mocking him while he's crucified. So the humiliation and mocking it begins before the crucifixion, but endures all the way up until and beyond. And there are 2 malefactors, or maybe not, but when the 6th hour came, darkness came over all the land until the 9th hour. So from this 6-hour period, so during the 3rd hour when he was hung on the cross all the way to the 6th hour, the whole in creation was subsumed in darkness. This was a plague. And then he says, my El, why hast thou forsaken me?" Quoting the psalmist. This is the most excruciating agony of the bitter passion. It was the spiritual separation from his Father, because at this wretched but glorious moment in time, he became sin, and the Father turned away from his presence. And Yahshua cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. That's the end. It is finished in John 19:31. This is his final words. We don't read what they are here. And there was also a woman watching him from a distance, among whom was Miriam from Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of Jacob, of James, and of Joseph and Shalom. We meet these females early on in the 16th chapter. They were there. They were witnesses to the crucifixion and initially the resurrection, although they initially were skeptical and doubted of the resurrection. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member who was himself waiting for the kingdom of heaven, came boldly, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Yahshua. So not all Pharisees, not all Sanhedrin were horrible people. The overwhelming mob vote was to get rid of him, to expel it, but there were some dissenters on there. There were ones who counseled against the excesses, and Joseph of Arimathea was one of them. Nicodemus, we only read of him in John's account, but Joseph of Arimathea was the one who had made the provisions and the preparations to provide for his burial, so that he was not let by the roadside. He was given the dignity and death that he was not allotted to in life. And he thus fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. He made his tomb. He died the death of the wicked, but made his tomb with the rich, because a council member meant he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the one who had collectively executed him. But the opening verse of the 16th chapter, this marks the lesson itself. And when the Sabbath was past, Miriam and Magdala and Miriam of Jacob and Shalom brought spices to go anoint him. Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. It is our version of Saturday. It is the day when Yahweh ceased creating. He rested from all his creation, and the Jews were commanded to commemorate that day with the day of rest. They were to do no work. They were to rest. They were to fellowship. They were to worship. They were to congregate, and they were not to travel more than a Sabbath day's journey, which was a day's mile. And the concept of Sabbath is alive and well in the Christian ethos, although many celebrated on Sunday because this event took place on what is commonly referred to as Resurrection Sunday, but is in fact more appropriate because Yahshua himself rested on the 7th day. So why should we rest when he is risen? That's a whole different controversy. One I'm going to do well to avoid, But the Mary Magdalene was the one from whom he had liberated 7 demons. We read of in Luke 3. So she was a demon-possessed woman who became the original witness of the resurrection, as well as the most exalted female ministerial companion of the Messiah. And we already read of Mary of James and Shalom. Shalom may have been a sister of John and James. So John and James were the sons of Zebedee. Mary was his wife's name. John alone of the 12 disciples had accompanied him all the way up to the resurrection. And embalming was not a customary practice among Jewish people, so what they did was they covered dead body with spices to alleviate somewhat the smell, because the smell of a dead body is never pleasant. And they went to anoint him with the full expectation that he was dead, but they wanted to give him the proper burial rites. Little did they know they were in for a surprising awakening, that he was not dead, but he was risen. And very early morning, on one of the Sabbath, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. So the Sabbath rose and fell when the sun rose. The Jews mark their days by sunrise. We think of morning. Their day begins when the sun rises, and when the sun sets is when it actually begins. So their Sabbath begins on our Friday night, lasts all the way till our Saturday evening, whereas our Sabbath begins Sunday morning and lasts all Sunday day. The Jews have a different conception of when day begins, but because the sun had risen, this means it is very early morning on Sunday morning, and they had returned to the tomb when the sun had risen very early in the morning. So they were there bright and early first thing in the morning. They had respect enough for the Sabbath not to violate it, but once it was over, they wasted no time getting to it. And remember that a mile's journey was a Sabbath day's journey in ancient Israel. We who live in the age of automobiles have a somewhat different standard. It does not make us less righteous, it just makes us more realistic. And they said among themselves, "Who shall roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us?" So this tomb was guarded by a Rome which carried the insignia of the Roman Empire, meaning that there were grave, fatal consequences for breaking it. It aligned you in rebellion against Rome. It was an attack against Rome itself. And the stone would have been a lot easier to roll into place than it would be to remove. This is a tomb. This is something that no one can get into except the angel who was there working for them on their behalf and on their behest. They're the ones who lift it up as though it was nothing. They are the ones who had rolled away the tomb for us. And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was extremely large. The stone was extremely large beyond any person, let alone machine's capacity to uplift and uproot and move, but angels working on their behalf. These are the secret. These are the ones before whom no obstacle, no matter how voluminous or weighty, poses any hindrance in their getting it out of the way in order for the risen sun to return to the earth which had rejected it, to bless it with his grace and presence once more. And having entered into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, wearing a white robe, and they were greatly alarmed. This young man is not the Messiah itself, but it is an angel. They are clad in white. White is the color of purity and divinity, and in that the significance of the symbolism of the color repeats and rebounds throughout the book of Revelation. Frequently we find angels clad and saints clothed in white, white being that they have been washed clean by the blood of the Lamb. So white means that they are pure and they are sacred. And the young man, they were greatly alarmed. They were not expecting to see a live person. They were expecting to see a dead body. They were expecting to see the tomb in place and intact. They wanted to give spices, drop spices around the body. Yet the tomb was open, and there was a man in it, and he was clothed in white. And they were greatly alarmed, and rightly so. And he said to them, "Do not be much alarmed. You seek Joshua of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is raised. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." So he tells them some items of startling information. He says there's no reason to be concerned or alarmed or amazed. You came seeking Joshua of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. Many of you saw him crucified. You'd think he'd be dead, but he is in fact risen. He is not here. He has risen from the tomb, from the grave, from hell, from the ground. He is among the earth right now. He is not here. He was here, but he is risen. He is no longer here. And this is the place where they laid him, but you cannot confine the Messiah in a tomb or a building or anywhere else, because he is risen, he is eternally alive. This must not alarm you that he is not here. He was killed in the body, but his body was resurrected. He is somewhere else right now. He is not here. You seek him, you will not find him here, but you will find him, because remember his promise that he would appear to Galilee, to the disciples. And go say to his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. You should see him there, as he said to you. So these women, the disciples would have been the 12, the 11 at this point, because Judas would have already killed himself. But the disciples were an aristocratic designation in the Gospels. These were the most intimate followers and companions and disciples of the Messiah. They came to be known as the apostles henceafter, beginning in the book of Acts. And Peter was the chief one. He was the leader, the spokesman of the group. And he had his moment of serious failing rather recently, when he denied in the 14th chapter, when he, as predicted by the Messiah, denied him 3 times. But he also reminded him to remind Peter that he had the reminder and the promise that he would be before him in Galilee. And what he promises will be fulfilled and will be true, and you just have to be there to know it. And they went out and fled from the tomb, and were trembling and bewildered, and they spoke to no one, for they are afraid. So consternation, bewilderment, and fear is what is on their mind. So they fled from the tomb. They're trembling, they're scared, they're frightened. They don't know what to make out of it. And this leaves an ultimately disappointingly unconclusive conclusion. But the fact is that the original manuscripts of Mark did in fact, or at least the oldest surviving manuscripts of Mark, end abruptly at this point. They may have been ripped. So what we read after this was added sometime in the 200s, the 3rd century. But it is authentic enough to the original article. This isn't the only thing in the New Testament that was not written originally. John's 8th chapter, the encounter with a woman caught in adultery, is as early as 200 years old. The Trinitarian witness in the 5th chapter of John's first epistle is also 200 years old. or dates to the 200 BCs. That's when the doctrine of the Trinity would have gained salience. But what's important here is that that the record is preserved, so we accept what comes after it, even if it did not come from the pen of Mark. It came from the oral tradition. So much of what Mark before this is imitated by others. He is the founder of what is known as the Synoptic Gospels. So much of the material that Matthew and Luke, which is not original, now 42% of Matthew is original material, 54% of Luke is not, but what most of what comes from Mark, the earliest chronologically one. Yet what comes after this is based, we have the version of the Great Commission. We read of Matthew's Great Commission in 28 verses 19 through 20, and Luke not in the Gospel but in Acts 1:8. But we're actually going to save what remains verses 9 through 20 for a separate lesson, because we're less than halfway through and we only have 10 minutes left, so we're probably not going to make it. We want to give it the full focus it deserves. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.